Well, in any Roman town you find a lot of different types of jewellery. The main thing being brooches, because brooches were used like we use Velcro or safety pins today. They were actually holding the clothing together, because most women's sort of tunics, and it tended to be sort of long t-shirt shaped sort of tunic they wore, were fastened at the shoulders with brooches. Now some of those brooches had a chain that joined one to the other to stop it sort of slipping off your shoulders. And they were quite decorative. Sometimes they were enamelled, so they were quite brightly coloured. But most brooches, although they were gold looking, weren't made of gold. Gold was too soft for a brooch, and they used the copper alloy, but made it look a goldy colour. So it was all very sort of brightly coloured, if you imagine sort of reds and blues and greens of enamels in these brooches. And some of them were quite sort of delicate little brooches, and some of them were novelty, fun ones. You get brooches that are fish shape or boat shaped. Just, you know, obviously people like to choose, and so you could choose the sort of brooches you wanted. So brooches were an important part of what you wore. But then people also wore things like finger rings, and finger rings sort of vary. Quite a lot of them were worn on the thumb, so they're quite sort of heavy things. And a lot were made of iron, and you tend to think of iron looking a bit sort of black and rusty looking these days. But new iron looked silvery colour, so they made it look like silver even though it was made of iron. And a lot of these rings would have had sort of seals set into that part of the ring, so that you could actually press that into wax when you wanted to seal a document or something like that. And of course ladies' hairstyles were always long, and it meant that they wore their hair up in fancy styles. So you get hairpins of all different shapes and sizes. And because of that, you can actually tell the fashion for hairstyles, because in the 1st century, and we can tell it from the portraits of the empresses on coins, they had very fancy hairstyles that were built up quite high on frames. So if you had that, you needed a long-handled pin to actually be able to anchor all that in place. But by the 3rd century, 200 years later, the hairstyles had changed, and it was much more sort of crimped waves with a bun at the back. So if you've only got a bun at the back, you needed a short pin to actually hold the hair in place. So that sort of thing can actually tell us a lot about sort of fashionable hairstyles. The colours in jewellery did symbolise social class, because you could only wear gold and silver if you were sort of from the upper classes. So that's why a lot of the jewellery is gold coloured rather than gold, because you wanted to sort of look as though you had money, but you weren't allowed to actually wear gold and silver. There were some differences in the jewellery worn by male and female, because of course the costume was slightly different. So the men wouldn't have needed brooches to hold their sort of tunics together, but they needed brooches for their cloaks. So theirs would have been a similar style, but probably a more rugged, more sort of substantial style of brooch. Whereas women had lots of different novelty things, and would have worn sort of trinkets, a bit like we wear badges and brooches today. So there would have been quite a difference in the brooches worn. The rings would have varied, because of course men's rings would have been chunkier, and they would have been worn to show their class, but also because of these seals in them. That was really worn by the men so that they could seal their documents. It was felt that women probably didn't need to sort of seal documents quite so much, because they weren't involved in business quite so much.